Welcome, everyone. We are going to spend some time today talking about how do you enable a distributed engineering team with a particular flavor of how do you do that right now in a very complex time in the world with the coronavirus going on. And so what we're finding is we've worked with our customers for years on how to use metrics to enable engineering teams. And so it's particularly relevant now to talk about work from home structure, as many teams have migrated from office-based structures to work from home structures over the last 45 days. And so specifically what we're going to dive into today is the work from home topic. And we're going to spend about a half hour talking about key trends we're seeing, strategies for using metrics to enable work from home teams. How I'm going to do that is I'm going to go through just an overview of the things we think you should look at to understand work from home patterns first. And then second part of this is going to be to dig into some real key use cases and questions. So essentially, what are the problems you want to solve? Are we seeing higher rework? Are requirements being passed through the development process the same? Is code review collaboration still happening the same way it was? Are some teams reacting less positively than others to the transition to work from home? And so we will go into specific use cases and then we'll have Q&A. And so if you have questions as we go along, log them in the Q&A box. Dan, is that the right place to put them?
Correct. Yep. I'll be keeping an eye there.
And then we'll answer those at the end. So first of all, I'm going to do 30 seconds on what is Pluralsight Flow, so we know what we're talking about when I talk about metrics. So Pluralsight Flow is a product that started about 5 years ago as GitPrime. GitPrime joined the Pluralsight family just about a year ago this week. And the whole purpose of Pluralsight Flow is to connect to your source code repositories and your ticket tracking systems to generate actionable metrics and data about the workflows in your engineering organization. And there's really two big reasons to do that. One is to create visibility. So up and down your leadership structure, everyone can see what's happening from detailed workflows up to high-level trends. And then the second piece, and this is something we'll dive into today, is to identify process inefficiencies and bottlenecks and opportunities for improvement so that you can enable your team to be more successful. So a successful flow implementation starts with visibility and then moves to process improvement, and it gives you the ability to see your historical metrics and then make them better, which is great. So let's talk about what's happened in the last 2 months. So depending on your development methodology, many of the different variations of development methodologies are dependent on in-person collaboration and on close team collaboration. They're built around team concepts where cross-functional teams share business requirements with engineers, iterate, and get to a final product that solves a business solution. So the concept of working in person has obviously changed. No longer can do in-person stand-ups and sprint planning. The way that managers work with their individual team members has changed. And there's a concept of all meetings now being remote. Developers now have a lot less structure. And that is resulting in some engineers having more time to code and others struggling with figuring out how to manage their time. So a couple of themes you're going to hear here is how do we make sure a team is set up to succeed in a work from home structure? How do we ensure that requirements are still being defined correctly, communicated correctly, iterated on in a productive way, and leading to a good business outcome? And how do you just make sure your team is feeling culturally good in this different time that we're in? We're going to talk about metrics quite a bit over the next 30 minutes. And I thought I'd start just with how do you gauge if things are going well or not going well? And what we found is that we can pretty quickly work with each of our customers to understand things that are going well and not going well. And so this stoplight analogy here will let you give us a starting point. And so the first thing to think about is, if your team was working at a certain level of output, that could be productive throughput, which is the amount of code generated when you take out churn, or it could be impact, which is a flow metric that measures the quantity and complexity of code delivered. There's been a change in workflows, and we're seeing that leads to some adjustment. But if your output levels are still at 95% or higher where they were previously, that's a good sign. Next, we look at rework. And so churn is the percentage of code that is reworked shortly after being created. And if we're seeing churn pop above 30%, that's problematic. If it's staying below 30%, that's a good sign that rework is not getting out of control. And then another metric we'd look at is your code review cycle time, which we look at by measuring how long it's taking to complete pull requests. And if the pull request cycle time is within 10% of where it was previously, that's pretty positive. As we go down to yellows here, I'm going to talk about some underlying metrics that would indicate kind of smoke before fire on the ones above. So if I talk about pull request cycle time as the amount of time it takes to complete code review, one of the key sub-steps there is how quickly are engineers responding to each other. So one of the things we're going to look at is how quickly are engineers responding to each other's pull requests now compared to when they were in the office together. Similarly, we're going to look at commit work patterns. If the number of days a week an engineer commits code, or the number of commits they do overall has dropped by more than 20%, we'd see that as a warning sign that something is notably different in work patterns. And on the concept of churn, even if you're below that 30% level that I had up in the green, if it's spiking a bunch, that is an indicator that probably there's some requirements issues we want to dig into. And then finally, kind of the inverse of all these topics, if you're seeing unreviewed pull requests going through, so code's not getting reviewed, and if you're seeing notable increases in your pull request time, your output is dropping or your churn is high, those are things that we want to flag. So here's what we're going to try to cover. If this webinar is successful today, you will know how to diagnose all these questions. So the first thing is, how would I even know if my releases today are similar or different than a pre-COVID release? How would I compare that? The next question is has my total productive throughput or output of my team changed as we've moved into this work from home environment? How do I know if there's spikes in rework? And then really one of the things we're going to talk about is you might look at your aggregate organization and it might be relatively similar in output to where it was pre-COVID. But what we find is even in that scenario, if you go down to the team level, some teams have responded well, some teams have notably different work patterns, and we take it down to the individual level. Some individuals have notably different work patterns, positively and negatively. And so what we want to do is give you the ability to just understand where have things changed at the team and individual level so you can coach effectively. And then we'll look at code review response times. Is code going through unreviewed, and are there bottlenecks in the process? So I'm going to kind of get in the first section of what metrics we think you should look at. And to frame this up, we think you should have three mindsets in terms of how you look at your organization. High-level trends. So, you know, it's now been about 45 days since everyone went to work from home for the most part. How does that 45-day period compare to the prior 45-day period? If I look over the last 90 days, how do those two discrete 45-day periods compare to each other? The second level is release level. Whether you're running 2-week sprints, continual delivery, different strategies by team, how does the makeup and work product and output of each of those releases now compared to what happened previously? And then finally, we want to talk about workflows. If I'm an engineer, has the way that I commit code, has the size of my commits, has the frequency of my commits changed, has the way I collaborate with other people changed, and what's different? And so I'm going to go through these three areas. To begin with longer term trends, we want to look at trends in how engineers are coding. And in our system, we believe that the most effective way to do that is to look at complementary metrics together. And so we'll start with our fundamentals view, our code fundamentals. But what this does is it lets us look at 4 key metrics. How many, and the key thing on these reports here that we call the fundamentals is they're standardized to be per engineer per week. So when we say coding days are 2.7, what that means is if you have a group of 100 engineers, across those 100 engineers, the average is 2.7 days a week that an engineer commits code. And so if I commit code on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, that's 3 days as an example. But this is going to tell us, has the number of days a week that our team is committing changed as we've moved? And then commits per day is going to tell us, is the number of commits they do on those days changing? And so this is going to give us a read on, are committing work patterns similar or different to how they used to be? And then we have a metric at Flow called impact that measures the quantity and complexity of code delivered. That's going to tell us if the total output has changed over this last 90-day period. And then efficiency is telling us what % of code is productive code versus churn. So when I put these 3 things together, I can look at a 90-day trend on these 4 metrics, and I can see have my commit work patterns changed, has my team's output changed, and has their rate of rework changed. And the key thing here is that you can drill down to the team level. And really the key thing, as I mentioned, is understand this at the team level. I would say one of the big takeaways we've had around the coronavirus situation is that if you have 25 teams and they all move to work from home, 10 might do it great, 5 might do it okay, and 10 might do it really poorly. And the real key thing as leaders is to figure out those 10 that are struggling and coach them into the right work patterns. Similarly, there's high-level trends we can look at in code review coverage and response times. So here we're looking at when individuals submit pull requests and someone comments on them, how quickly does that individual get back and provide further comment? And what % of the time are they responding? And what % of the time are they doing a follow-on commit? And what portion of code is going through unreviewed? As we'll talk about, this fourth metric is a really key one that we're working with our customers on right now. If previously to the coronavirus, your unreviewed PRs was under 10% and it's now at 20%, that means a significant increase has occurred in the amount of code that's going unreviewed, and that's a breakdown in your review process that we can flag easily. Similarly, we want to look at how people are collaborating with each other. If someone else is reviewing my pull request, how long is it taking them to respond? If this reaction time is going up significantly, that means that engineers are stuck waiting for feedback and we're causing delays in the review process. Next, I'm going to move quickly through some key concepts around release level retrospective. So you've understand your long-term trends, and now you want to say, okay, how do I figure out what's happening on a sprint by sprint basis? So one of the keys in the Flow environment is to configure time windows that represent your sprints or your releases, so that you can do sprint breakdown on multiple levels. And so what our project timeline view allows you to do is to take a sprint, look at daily output across the sprint, and then also look at the type of work delivered across the sprint. When is new work delivered? When is updates to older code or legacy refactor delivered? How much of the code delivered is actually engineers completing each other's code? And how much is rework of recent code? And so this gives you a view release by release to see total output across the release, to compare that to previous sprints, and to understand what parts of the release are heavy in churn, and if we're seeing large increases in engineers completing each other's code. And in the system, for those of you that use the system quite a bit, we then will show you kind of which team members are driving each different type of code, so you can drill in and understand what projects are driving a rework or what projects are requiring engineers to help each other. But the point here is you should be able to really break down your release and say, how is my release different today, my release process different today than it was 2 months ago? We have a complementary report called the retrospective that lets us take a period of time and compare it to the time before it. And so we're using this quite a bit to look at post work from home and pre-work from home from a comparison standpoint. And what this is going to do is show you weekly output across a configurable period. Now we're getting to about 6 weeks since we've worked from home. But this will basically just say, team by team, show me the 6 weeks we've worked from home, compare them to the 6 weeks before. Tell me if my productive throughput, which is the amount of code excluding churn, has changed. Tell me if the raw throughput, which is just the total amount of code, has changed. Tell me if my efficiency rate, which reflects how much rework, has changed. And tell me if my work patterns have changed in terms of coding days and commits per day. And so those two things give you a very straightforward way to kind of look at that medium layer of not a 90-day trend, but how am I working on a release by release basis. And then similarly, you can get detailed views on your pull request process and on code review to look at how code review is occurring across your release process with distributions that are showing not just the averages of how long it's taking to do pull requests, but how many instances do we have that are really long pull requests. The final thing we recommend looking at within the context of code review within the release process is release by release to look at who is collaborating with whom from a review standpoint. And so this is a view that is showing us, JJ Jones reviewed 33 PRs in this particular release. I can see which engineers JJ reviewed, and then I can see my response times by team and by release to understand if my collaboration timeliness has changed and if my unreviewed PR levels have changed as we've gone to a work from home environment. So the idea is that should allow you to really create an informed analysis by team, by release, have my coding patterns and my code review patterns changed at a release level since we've gone into the COVID environment. And then finally, I mentioned there's a more granular level. This is where a manager would really go get more context and more detail and can drill into the granular detail of daily work patterns. And so this is a view called the work log that lets us see each engineer's code commit activity, their PR activity, and their ticket activity from JIRA. And we can see, what days of the week they're active. The size of the circle tells you the size of the commit. And there's a drill down view where we can even break down their day. And you can see, when are people working morning, evening, afternoon, and how does that tie into the collaboration pattern for the team? And we're finding this is, I think philosophically, most engineering managers we work with look at this and they're saying, we want to provide some flexibility and let engineers be mature people that figure out when they work. But there are a subset of engineers that I think haven't worked from home that are struggling with how do I create structure to succeed. And so this particular view is particularly interesting in the scenario where a manager needs to coach and help an engineer on how to structure their day and how to be successful. And it lets them go in and say, let's code in this time window. Let's do code review in this time window. This is when you should go do PRs. And also then the manager can see which possible projects are causing issues for that engineer as they go through their day. Similarly, there's a pull request deep dive. I've mentioned the concept of trying to determine if more code is going through unreviewed. This is a view that if you saw that my unreviewed pull request levels have gone up by 10%, you would filter it, and there's drill down on all these, but these are individual pull requests that you can drill into. So that is kind of the overview of the types of metrics we recommend using. Let's dive in a little more to some specific business questions. So let's say you say, great, I understand my trends. I know how to compare last 45 days to the prior 45 days. What do I do about it? So the first one we get a lot is, our churn and rework spiking? And what do I do about it? And so what we recommend here is that you use our project timeline view at the team level to understand when churn is spiking. And basically when you see days above 30%, or more than 30% of the code on a day is churn, we think it's worth digging in to understand. And so the paradigm exists here for you to see your team level churn by day, and then see which engineers are contributing to that, then to drill into a detailed view for this particular engineer. So we see the team here. We see Rob is someone who has some churn in this release. We can dig into a detailed profile of Rob. We can see his commit breakout, how many of his commits are large versus small, how much of his code is new work versus churn. In this example, we can see about a quarter of his commits are very large ones, about half are very small ones, and that a majority of his code is actually churn. And then we have the ability to go look at the specific commits that Rob did, and we'll flag them by size with this circle, and you can see the red lines here telling how much of churn. So basically the paradigm is here for a manager to find out which teams are having churn spikes and drill down to the individual level and the commit level and drill into the commit. And so as a leader, if you're thinking, how is churn impacting me? You can find out when it occurs. You can find out what projects are driving it. And that should give you the data to dig in and really understand what's causing that. Is it fundamental change in requirements? Is it an engineer that just needs a different communication pattern? We're finding this is just a very effective way to identify where you've got breakdowns and diagnose them and solve them. Another big question we get is my output per release changing? We'll get CTOs and VPs of engineering that say, my leadership and my board is asking me, are we more effective or are we less effective now that we're in a work from home environment? And so there's some simple ways to do this analysis. We can take our project timeline by release. We can look at multiple metrics there. Our impact metric that looks at the quantity and complexity of code delivered. We can look at total code delivered. We can look at commit volumes, and we can compare a current release to a prior release. So we can see in this example that the impact for the April 10th release is 479 per day, and it was 546 on the March 26th release, which is a 12% decrease. We can similarly run the retrospective view that I talked about and we can see that productive throughput is down 7.8% and raw throughput is down 15.9%. So what you're seeing is 3 different metrics that are telling slightly different stories, but the same story. Impact, which is quantity and complexity of code, is down 12%. Productive throughput, which is code excluding churn, is down 8%. Raw throughput, which is total code, is down 16%. Those are all providing complementary ways to understand that, in this case, we're probably seeing a low teens percentage decrease in output per release. Another big one is which engineers are affected by this change the most, and how do I help them? Like that's a very common one from managers. It's not a question of, it's really a question coming from the point of how do I help, right? And so we have a view in the system called the player card that takes 12 different metrics, and it lets you trend them over time for each engineer. And the idea here is that a leader can run this for everyone on their team over the last 90 days, and they can see which metrics are notably different in the last 45 days compared to the 45 days prior to that. And it's different things for different engineers, but we can look at commit frequencies, we can look at output, we can look at churn levels, we can look at code review response times, we can look at what % of PRs are going unreviewed. And the idea here is just to understand where things are different, where that's okay, and where a manager can coach. And particularly in the absence of a manager being able to sit down one-on-one with an engineer, having data that gives indicators on where things are different creates a more constructive coaching discussion. Another big trend in work from home is whether code review is bottlenecking. So you used to have teams that could sit down next to each other and talk about code, right? Or talk about code, but talk about the work product that they're putting through the process. And so what we see on some teams is that really there's 1 or 2 people that everything goes through. And when you were in person, that was generally okay because you could grab them and talk to them, but they're not available in the same way. And so one of the things we're asking our customers to do is to try to characterize their teams in terms of, do they have a centralized or a decentralized code review process? And so we have a specific view in Flow called the knowledge sharing view that is intended to tell you whether your code review is generally going through multiple people or 1 or 2. And so specifically what we recommend is that team by team, understand how centralized or decentralized your code review is. You can see that here in this knowledge sharing view. You can see it in the example I talked about earlier where JJ had the most pull requests. This is a little bit balanced, this example, but if JJ was out here and the next person was here, that would be an indicator that we're really dependent on JJ. And then the next thing you can do is go look at JJ and the response times. And specifically, if we're seeing code review become more centralized into 1 or 2 people, and we're seeing response times higher than they were, that's an indication that the work from home structure is putting stress on code review, and we want to coach that and adjust it. Another one I've alluded to is, are more pull requests going through unreviewed? This is actually a real problem we're seeing with customers and their data, is that part of going to work from home when you're not used to it is you can maybe skip some steps and things are happening in less structured ways. And a specific output is that the % of pull requests going unreviewed is increasing. So this is just a real simple one where we say you should run a 90-day trend. And if your unreviewed pull requests are higher over the last 45 days than they were pre-COVID, let's dig in. And there's detailed drill down as I talked about. And this is something you can look at it at the team level. So in aggregate, it might look okay, but you might have specific teams or even specific individuals where this is taking off, and you want to nip that in the bud. So these were the questions I said we'd answer. In the Q&A, if I didn't answer them, please push me on it. But how would you compare a current release to a pre-COVID release? We'd use the project timeline and retrospective reviews to do release level retrospectives, to look at output levels, to look at churn levels, to look at and compare those to previous releases. Has total productive throughput changed? We would look at that in the retrospective and with our high level trends. And we basically say, has our impact or our productive throughput changed since we've worked from home? So some companies, by the way, are finding it's higher when you work from home. And we're continuing to start to see a trend that maybe work from home will be something that lasts a long time, because for some teams it's very positive. The important part is to have data to determine if it's positive and not make that a subjective decision. mean, in terms of spikes and rework, we looked at how we would, we'd break down a release process to figure out what days have high churn and how we drill into that to understand the underlying projects. In terms of team members changing their behavior, we would look at that work log that's breaking out their day and what they do across a week. And we'd look at that player card that's going to show the trend. Code review response times, specifically, we're going to look at the collaboration metrics around response times by both submitters and reviewers. And we'll look at the unreviewed pull request metric, and then bottlenecking, we would look at really, are there one or two people things are running through and have response times changed? So those are the general concepts we wanted to cover. I guess one question we get sometimes is, okay, great, can I see my metrics? The thing, this is less a sales plug and more a point of, hey, if you want to see how your team has done in the COVID period, we can install a trial, and then now, you can see it this week, that will go back in time and generate metrics on your data. So if you want to run this analysis of the last 90 days, running a trial is an easy way to do that, and we have a cloud option and an on-premise option to do that. All right, so how did I do on time? Almost 30 minutes, just under. So how are we doing on questions?
Yeah, we had some really good questions come in and that I can kind of start making my way through. First of all, John asked, could you define churn more clearly? How is it different than refactoring?
Yeah, so we see overall edits to code in two categories. Actually, technically, we see it in three categories. We see updates to older code as what we call legacy refactor. So if I go back and update code that was finalized 6 months ago, we see that as indicative of updating your code base, or essentially paying down technical debt, some would call that, or productive updates to your code base. And we see recent rework as what we call churn. And so we specifically define churn as when an engineer updates their own code, and they're updating code that has been touched in the last 3 weeks. And legacy refactor is when an engineer updates their own code and they update code that is older. And then the third type of updates we see is when an engineer updates another engineer's code. And we believe the process of an engineer helping another engineer complete their code within a release cycle is different than an engineer reworking their own code. But churn is essentially a rework of code that was edited or created in the last 3 weeks. And a key thing on churn is that churn is a healthy thing. It's part of the development process. You should not have 0% churn. If you have 0% churn, that in its own right is a problem. But spikes in churn, we think churn tends to run about 10 to 30% of code. And when it spikes, that's when it's interesting to look at.
Awesome. Drew asked, while the data that comes back from Flow is amazing and revealing, would the developers feel like they are being micromanaged?
Sure, that's a very important, relevant question. The short answer to that is that there's a couple pieces to dive into on this question about how engineers feel about the data. When the data is used to remove bottlenecks for them, it is enabling. When the data is used to be critical of an engineer, it is negative. And so what you'll find is that we work very closely with our customers on how do you culturally work with data, how do you roll it out, and how do you communicate it. And we believe strongly that there is huge power in enabling teams to be more successful by using this data to remove bottlenecks, to understand deviations in work patterns and use it as a coaching tool. But data needs to be used to enable coaching and to make teams better. And there's a huge focus on that in both how we structured our system and the way the data is presented and how we coach and train managers to use the data.
Great. Joe asked, do you solely focus on developers? What about business analysts, testers, DevOps activities, and business SMEs getting their tasks completed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say Git Prime, when it started, was started to solve a specific problem, which was to get data out of Git. And we felt that commit and pull request activity in Git was data that was locked away in a black box and you couldn't see it really. And so we've worked hard to solve that. And so the core of our metrics started with the goal of showing Git-based activity, and we've extended that to include JIRA and ticketing-based activity, and we are continuing to expand that vision across the technical and development lifecycle. So short answer is I'd say that's a great question. The fundamental problem we started with was was code repository based, and we are continuing to expand into many areas, including integrating tightly into your skills development platform.
Great. Nadia asked, I'm a new manager just starting to use the tool and it's quite daunting. Where can I find a decent tutorial to learn how to use the tool?
So the tutorials I would start with are in the Pluralsight application. So there are videos built for managers that talk about how to use the data in Flow to effectively manage and coach your team. So I would specifically go into your Pluralsight skills platform and look for the Flow training videos there. If you don't know where those are, we can send you links to, it's called Flow Academy. And that's step one. Step two is we have created a number of good both blog posts, but specifically a book called 20 Patterns to Look For in Software Engineering with Data. And so we'd be happy to share that book with you as a hard copy or electronically. And it goes through 20 different work patterns you can look for. And typically what happens is you read the book and, 3, 5, 8 of them are particularly relevant to you and the rest are interesting, but not where you start. But it gives you a bunch of choices on what to look at. And so what I would say is when you're new to Flow, consistently people say to me, there's a lot of data here. And that's not always positive. Too much data can be overwhelming. Mapping it to the right business applications is where the power is. So the training videos, the 20 Patterns book are the starting points. And finally, I would say your customer success team's goal is to help you with that too. So reach out to us also.
Great. Connie asked, I can see the benefits for coaching and productivity for developers. Can we also get the same benefits for test analysts and business analysts?
Yeah, so I would say if the test analysts and business analysts are working in JIRA and in Git, then there's useful data that we can pull there and show straight away. It kind of depends where they work and how they do their work. But anything in your Git repositories and in your ticketing systems would be data that we can access for you.
Great. Michael asked, is there any way to correlate the code with stories or JIRA items for helping teams better estimate their story size with code artifacts?
Yeah, awesome question. So I would say we are on a 3-step journey there, and we think that is a very relevant question. And so this journey that has 3 steps that I alluded to is as follows: connecting to your Git data, connecting to your JIRA data, and allowing it to be joined is step 1. And that's a step that we have already completed. And what you'll see if you go in the system is you'll see JIRA information in the work log. As part of that, what we recommend is using either a workflow methodology or a tool that enforces it to put your ticket number in your commit message. And what you'll find is you can now filter the work log by ticket number, so you can see all the activity by ticket. The second step is we are already far into development on and soon releasing a set of metrics in the system that will really be JIRA and ticketing oriented metrics. And then the third piece of that is to allow you to take the join between tickets and commits and to roll up your Git data by the things tickets roll into, which are releases, epics, stories, features. And then you can take a feature and you can say it was this many story points in JIRA, it required this many commits, this many lines of code, had this much rework, this much impact, this many pull requests in Git, and bring that together. And so I lay out that journey because it's one we've been on and continue to proceed on. And we believe we're going to have the most comprehensive capabilities there in the industry. But what's interesting is that's all available in our data model too. So that step 1 is done and exposed in our APIs, and we can help you get that data now through the APIs, and it'll be in our UI as we progress. Long answer, sorry, but good question.
No, that's great. Tyga asked, from a security standpoint, how much access to Git and JIRA does this give to Pluralsight Flow?
Yeah, good question. So we connect to the Git source repositories and to JIRA through the standard API layers of GitHub, Bitbucket, Azure DevOps, GitLab, etc. You would configure a service account that would handle that connection to those systems. And you would specify which repositories you want to give access to We would analyze those repositories, generate metadata about those repositories so that we have metrics in our system. And then we have a data security model within Pluralsight Flow that is pretty granular and flexible, that allows you to control which data your actual engineers and engineering leaders can see, whether they just see themselves, their teams, the whole organization, and which metrics. And so without getting into great detail, there's a strong security model there, but it's a connection through the standard API layer using a service account with a really strong authorization model on the app side. So.
Great. Connie asked a follow-up question. When all work is allocated to tickets in JIRA, is there a metrics to show how much time is spent on an initiative level?
Yes, so that step 2 of the journey where we are developing and releasing metrics around your ticket behavior and ticket activity. And the short answer is we have the JIRA data in our system, and reports in our UI are on their way.
Great. Daniel asked, not me, different Daniel, is there a connection or integration between skills and flow to get insight on how learning a new skill or improving existing skills might influence the workflow of a developer?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is, and it's something we'd be happy to show you in our live production cloud environment, because it's in production and used by a number of our customers. But specifically, we have metrics that are generated at the language level in Flow that will show you efficiency of your engineering teams by coding language, and we tie that to your skill IQ levels by language, so that you can look at Pluralsight skill IQs next to coding efficiency by language, and diagnose by language both where further skills development would be appropriate, and also to look at progress in your coding efficiency as you complete skills development. So it is an indicator of where to skill up, and it's also a way to measure the progress of your skill development platforms, or of your skill development programs.
Great. Nadia has a follow-up question. If you have different teams that have different sprint cycles, can you set up the metrics to track the different cycles per team?
Yeah, you can set the sprint cycles in the system up to be global or at the team level. So that's a common use case, and one where, yes, you definitely could do that.
Great. I have a question from Daniel. I'm thinking that they're asking when should a company consider using Flow? And I'm guessing that means like at what stage of growth? If not, Daniel, please clarify otherwise, but that's what I kind of think they're implying.
I mean, my short answer is any company that's using Git and coding through Git as their primary source code repository system, there's direct applications of Flow. And whether you just started and are trying to get the right workflows in place at a early stage of your process, or whether you've been using Git for many years, there are relevant things you can learn by having more data at any stage of your evolution, and we will help you find the ones that are appropriate for your stage of evolution.
Great. Have another question here for you. This one's from Stanley. What are some of the key trends that you have seen in customer data in late March and early April as companies have reacted to the COVID-19 situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so I would say the first thing we're seeing is that variation at the team level is notable. A lot of companies are saying, go work from home, or out of necessity, but then how that adjustment goes is really up to the leads and managers at the team level. And some teams are adapting well, and some teams are not, or they're struggling more. And so I think the first observation we have is there's more variability across organizations than I probably would have thought. And where we see that variability, the specific metrics are, the breakdown points I would say are requirements not being communicated in the same way, which manifests itself in higher rework and churn. The code review process breaking down, which manifests itself in centralized code review, which is a metric we have, how centralized or decentralized is your code review, but more specifically code review reaction times, PR cycle time, and the percent of PRs going unreviewed. And then it manifests itself in individual work patterns. So specifically, I would say that the most notable takeaway I've had is that the variability at the team level is most distinct. And like big value of the program is you might do a cursory review and say things are okay, but if you go down to the team level, there's still teams typically that can be helped. And if overall you look okay, but there's certain teams that you can coach and help, it makes the whole much stronger.
Great. I'm seeing one more question here from Jan. So if you're listening and you do have one more question you'd like to ask, get that in there ASAP. But the question from Jan is, how well do the management strategies you discussed today apply to teams of third-party contractors?
The whole concept of understanding the work patterns and productivity of third-party contractors is a huge area for us. That is a really big benefit of the program. I'd say there's a different mindset probably in looking at third-party contractors than internal team members for many companies. And a big part is cultural. I think, when you think of your own team, I would say engineering more than any discipline really believes correctly that the right culture is what makes teams successful longer term. So internally, there's a big focus on enablement, coaching, team level outcomes, making teams better. As you get to third-party contractors, those things still apply, but you're also making more of a financial investment, and you want to make sure that you're getting return on that financial investment. So there's probably a little more of a mindset for our customers that have third-party contractors on A, as resources turnover, how is that affecting output and productivity, and B, are we getting an appropriate level of activity and output for what we're investing in. So, but short answer is yes, it's a very valuable business application for us in a way that a significant portion of our customers use it as part of their data. So.
That's great. And like I said, that was the last question, Brian. So I think it might be good if you kind of leave a final takeaway or a next step to everyone who's joined us today. Yeah,
thanks. So thank you for joining. I would say a couple things. If you already are using Pluralsight Flow, let's make sure you feel really comfortable on what data to look at to understand this work from home concept. And if we can help you dig in further, we'd love to. So let your customer success lead know that you'd like to dive into this. I'm happy to help and enable as well. If you're not using Pluralsight Flow, I guess the main message I would have is it's really easy to actually check this out and to look at your team. We're pre-integrated to all the major Git hosts, and we could get a trial up and running that would show you the last 90 days of activity quickly, like by this week. And so if it sounds interesting, try it out. And I guess at a minimum, you can at least see your team's data through this work from home period. So thank you, everyone. My contact information is here, and my whole team would love to talk and help if we can in any way. And thanks for your time.
Yes,